This is Dolphins Today by Chat Sports. I am your host, Nic Rohloff, and we have an interesting show today because we do have a little bit of an update, if you can call it that, more maybe insight, I guess, on where we stand with Jonnu Smith. And then I also, on the back end of today's show, will talk about 3 questions going into Dolphins mandatory minicamp, which begins today on June 10th. It is 3 days, the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th. We'll have full coverage of that. But let's start with Jonnu Smith here because Barry Jackson was the person who kind of aggregated this. But as we talk about so often, Drew Rosenhaus is the agent for multiple Dolphins players, notably Tyreek Hill and Jonnu Smith. When asked about if Jonnu was going to attend Dolphins mandatory minicamp over the next 3 days, he said that Jonnu's situation is fluid and he would leave it at that. Well, my initial reaction to hearing what Drew Rosenhaus had to say was, well, I don't love that. Jonnu Smith, the Pro Bowl tight end from a year ago who had a career year, set single-season franchise tight end records with the Dolphins for receptions, yards, touchdowns. Like, I want him to stay in Miami. I think he wants to stay in Miami. But when the agent is publicly saying the situation is fluid, call me a pessimist, call me whatever you want, that makes me automatically think that things are going more poorly than positively. We'll have more on this conversation here in a second, but make sure you subscribe. Make sure you have your notifications turned on. We are on the road to 71K subs, but there's only 14.1% of you, aka 9.9 thousand, that have your notifications turned on. When news drops, we have you covered. I mentioned mini camps over the next 3 days. We will have live coverage of that as well. Be live on the channel later today too, so make sure you subscribe and have your notifications turned on. Well, going into minicamp when practice gets going later today, and I'm sure Mike McDaniel will be available for the media beforehand as well, the number one thing that I am looking for when it comes to the Miami Dolphins is not actually what's happening on the field. It is who is on the field. Will Jonnu Smith report to mandatory minicamp? We know Jalen Ramsey isn't, but then there's also other players who are coming back from injuries. Where do they stand in terms of their recovery? And are they participating in team or just personal drills? But Jonnu Smith, that's number one thing that we're working on and looking at. We've talked about it over the last 2 weeks when the initial trade report came out. Jonnu Smith wants to be a Miami Dolphin. It happened with the original Adam Schefter report that his preference is to stay in Miami on a reworked deal. Mike McDaniel a week and a half ago said that he wants to keep Jonnu Smith. Like, both the head coach and the tight end want him to be here. The issue, not sure if the man calling the shots with the roster in terms of the GM, Chris Grier, is willing to give him a revised contract, whether there is an added year to his deal, making him under contract for next season, or if he just wants to increase the salary. I don't think he wants to do either of those things, because if he did, I think we would already have a resolution by now. I can't imagine Jonnu Smith asking for the biggest bag of all time, considering he has only had one successful season. Now, it was very, very successful, and him playing on $4.8 million this year would be an absolute steal for the Miami Dolphins due to the production he had last year. But I want to keep him because there's a lot of, discussions about keeping good players in Miami, right? Dolphins let Andrew Van Ginkel go. They let Robert Hunt go. They let Minka Fitzpatrick go. They traded him. Obviously, there was a little bit more drama there. The point is this. The Dolphins have let a lot of good players leave their building and not paying them, and paid the wrong players. I think paying Jonnu Smith for 1 more year, not a bad idea. Now, am I giving him 2 more years? No, he's 30-plus years old. I'll give him 1 more year and maybe increase the money a little bit this season and just see how it plays out again. Like, I want Jonnu Smith here. I think most fans do as well. So why can't we just hold hands, sing Kumbaya, and figure this all out? That's at least the goal, right? Well, predict it for me. As minicamp gets underway today, let me know. Will Jonnu Smith be there? Will he report to minicamp? If he does not report to minicamp, the Dolphins are liable to fine him because it is mandatory. Type Y for yes or type N for no. This is how I look at the situation. If Jonnu Smith reports the mandatory minicamp today, it tells me the two sides are making progress and working on staying together for this upcoming season. If he does not report to minicamp and the Dolphins end up finding him, it feels like the relationship might start to get a little bit ugly. When you go back to what Drew Rosenhaus said on that weekly hit, he used the word fluid, as the situation is fluid. That could mean literally anything. And I think he purposely said that because he didn't want to share too much information. Because if him and the Dolphins are working on a rework contract or a small extension, well, then he's not going to want to let the public know that. And he could use the word fluid. But it also could mean, well, the conversations with Miami have not been going well, and we believe they are working towards a trade still. That could mean fluid. Either way, it's hard to really know what Rosenhaus meant by that, but it does sound to me, if I am just making a prediction, he won't be there for mandatory minicamp starting today. Because if he was going to be there, I think Drew Rosenhaus would have said, yeah, he's going to be there. So then it asks the question of, like, what do the Dolphins do next if this situation is beyond repair? Like, the tight ends outside of Jonnu Smith are absolutely abysmal. Like, you can't script a better horror movie than the other tight ends on this list. Like, we all don't really have a lot of good, positive feelings on Julian Hill. And if Jonnu Smith gets traded, Julian Hill would be your tight end one. It would be the worst tight end room in the entire NFL. And I think we could already say the Dolphins have the current worst quarterback room in the tight end. Like, I don't want to keep on piling up lists and lists and lists of needs for the Miami Dolphins. But Miami needs potentially a new tight end if they trade Jonnu Smith. They need at least one corner, but probably two corners after they trade Jaylin Ramsey. And they could use more interior line depth as well as offensive tackle depth as well. So they need offensive line depth. They could need a new starting tight end, and they already need one or two corners. It's almost July. That is not good to have that many needs, and we're not just talking mostly like rounding out the roster. No, we're talking tier 1 starting level positions. This is not good if you're the Miami Dolphins, which is why I think we need to get Jonnu Smith committed with the Dolphins sooner rather than later. But this is why you subscribe to the channel. Don't miss a thing. Daily Dolphins coverage, sometimes 2 videos a day. We'll be live later today, and we will have full Dolphins minicamp coverage on Tuesday during live, Wednesday, Thursday, everything in between. Hit that sub button and don't miss a thing. All right, minicamp does get started today, as I've consistently mentioned on today's show. So let's look at my top 3 Dolphins minicamp questions going into this 3-day portion here. Because after these 3 days, well, we're not seeing these players until mid-July when they report for training camp. So let's go with number 1. What's up with James Daniels? The Dolphins signed Daniels to the largest contract in free agency, not for the NFL, but for their own personal signings, on a 3-year, $24 million deal. Now, he was not there. He was not in attendance for voluntary OTAs. Well, if you remember, James Daniels suffered a torn Achilles in week 4 this past season for the Steelers, ending his season. Well, the Dolphins felt comfortable enough to give him a 3-year contract at a relatively solid AAV of $8 million per season. Well, we knew that he was likely not going to be ready for OTAs, probably not even mandatory minicamp. But will we see him in the building? Because we didn't really get any reports of him being in the building for OTAs. And I think we also have to talk about what offensive line configuration the Dolphins are ultimately going to roll with. We already know 3 positions, right? Austin Jackson is your starting right tackle. Patrick Paul is your starting left tackle, taking over for Teron Armstead, who retired. And Aaron Brewer returns as your starting center. But you signed Daniels in free agency. You drafted Savi Naya in the 2nd round after trading up in front of the New England Patriots, who were going to take him at 38, by the way. So, like, where do those 2 guys play? And that's another added question to this. Could we see where the 2nd round pick, Savi Naya, is ultimately going to play? He played right guard and right tackle mostly at college. I think it would be smart to plug him in at right guard in the NFL. Even though James Daniels is normally a right guard, he can move to left guard. The reason why I want to play Jonah at right guard is because I would like to have him surrounded by 2 veterans in Austin Jackson and Aaron Brewer. You put him on the left side, well, now you have a rookie in Savi Naya next to a first-year full-time starter in Patrick Paul. That could get dicey. But you have a veteran in Daniels next to Paul, and then 2 veterans next to Savi Naya. It could help some of the growing pains of those young offensive linemen. But it will be fascinating to see if we get some sort of offensive line configuration in mandatory minicamp. All right, moving on to question number 2. How bad is this Dolphins secondary? Obviously, Jalen Ramsey is going to be traded in the next 5 to 6 weeks, hopefully sooner rather than later, as I kind of talk about hoping to get a resolution for Jonnu Smith in that same time frame. Well, the projected starting secondary, it's not very pretty. Cam Smith and Storm Duck, at least right now, are your 2 projected outside corners because you just simply don't have much. I'm sorry, I'm not projecting a 5th-round pick in Jason Marshall Jr., who I have not seen on the football field yet, personally, as a starter. I don't think Artie Burns is a starter, so that is by default going to Storm Duck and Cam Smith. Kader Kohu is your best overall corner, but because of his size limitations, he will likely still be a nickel. And then your 2 starting safeties are Ashton Davis and Iafatu Melifonwu, 2 one-year deals that you signed in NFL free agency. Like, this is not a good secondary. And what I'll be watching for, at least from reports coming out of mandatory minicamp, all 3 days are viewable to the public. Well, not the public, but at least beat reporters. How do they perform against Tua Tagovailoa, Jalen Waddle, and the other players on offense like Devon Achane running routes, Nick Westbrook-Akini, Malik Washington? We won't really see Tyreek Hill. He's still recovering from that wrist surgery. Going to be ready for training camp in a month, but not ready right now. And are there any players that are sleepers? Could there be a UDFA like BJ Adams, Ethan Robinson that step up and make a push for the roster? Is Jason Marshall Jr. better than I anticipate? Could Artie Burns be a renaissance man after being a journeyman corner the last 4 or 5 years? Like, this secondary is going to just garner the most attention outside of Jonnu Smith. I'm personally really intrigued with the offensive line, which is why I have that as my number 1 question. But I think most of the public, in terms of Dolphins fans, are eyeing Jonnu Smith and eyeing the secondary. But let me know, be honest, before I get to my final question. Confidence level in this Dolphins secondary entering minicamp. Scale 1 to 10 for me down in the comments section. Let me know your thoughts down below. I'm moving on to the third question here. Is there a Jonnu Smith replacement on the roster? So this point could become moot if Jonnu Smith ultimately is at mandatory minicamp and signs are pointing to him being the starter once again in 2025. Well, as we showed the depth chart earlier, if Jonnu Smith, you wipe him off the face of this picture, your 5 tight ends are now Julian Hill, Pharoah Brown, Tanner Connor, Hayden Rucci, and Jaylin Conyers. I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. Like, who on earth would have confidence in those 5 tight ends if you remove Jonnu Smith from that group? The Dolphins would have to go out and sign someone. The issue, the best free agent tight ends available are Hayden Hurst and Gerald Everett. Those 2 guys aren't tight end ones in this day and age. So maybe you would have to then go to the trade market. Look at Michael Mayer from the Raiders. Could Kyle Pitts actually be available from the Falcons? What about Dawson Knox if the Bills would be willing to get rid of him from Buffalo? But you'd have to pay a premium on getting him from a rival. Like, the point is, I don't trust any of these tight ends on the roster outside of Jonnu Smith. And if he doesn't show up to minicamp, one of those 5 guys is going to be the starting tight end is before the Dolphins add someone. And that's concerning. But maybe they ball out. I don't know. But that's the point of the question being asked. Is there a Jonnu Smith replacement already on the roster? Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you follow me over on Twitter at Nic_Rohloff as we head out on today's video, because I will have highlights and more news/updates from Dolphins Minicamp over the next 3 days over on my social media. So if you want the most up-to-date coverage, subscribe and follow me at Nic_Rohloff.